Donald Trump has been elected as US president, and during his campaigning, he said that he's going to achieve peace in Ukraine within 24 hours, even while he's still president-elect. I have identified 5 potential scenarios how this could be done, but in this video, we are not just going to discuss them. We are also try to answer the questions. Why does he want to achieve peace? So what's the intention to achieve peace really fast? What would be necessary for him in this regard? What would be the problems? What would it mean for Ukraine, and what would it mean for NATO and for Europe, according to the 5 scenarios that I have identified? During his campaigning, he said again and again that he's going to end the war within 24 hours. Even while he's still president-elect and not inaugurated. This, in my mind, was clearly hyperbolic, like he always speaks in hyperbolic ways, in hyperbolic terms. He always uses the superlative, I think is the word. So it's the most beautiful, the most best, the greatest, or even the worst, the most stupidest. He never has something mediocre. When he talks, he always talks hyperbolic. So I personally would understand it more in a way like I want to end the war as fast as possible and I'm going to be successful. I never took it serious that he actually would end it within the first 24 hours after being elected. But why would he want to end the war? Before we discuss this, we need to initially talk about the current situation. Scholz and Biden are the 2 leaders of government that have the most influence on the war outside of Ukraine and Russia. They are the most important supporters, and both are on their way out of governing their countries. Both of them wanted to prevent a Ukrainian defeat, but neither of them wanted a Ukrainian victory. Whenever they sent aid to Ukraine, it was barely enough to prevent a collapse of the Ukrainians, but it was never enough to allow Ukraine to defeat Russia. A great example of this are the 31 M1 Abrams, the main battle tanks that the US sent. Now, there was the argument that they are too difficult to maintain, the supply chain is too complicated, and while some have criticized it, it was highlighted that even nations who operate the Abrams are still having contracts with US companies to do the maintenance, to run the supply chain, that it's actually really difficult. So even if we accept that argument, that Abrams is not a great tank, not the perfect tank for Ukraine, the moment they send 31, they already need to set up everything to have the maintenance going, to have the supply chain going, all of this, then there was no need to simply restrict it to only 31. Even a 0 afterwards, 310, would not have bankrupted the US, and they would not have depleted the US army stocks to a degree that they would no longer be able to fight a conventional war. Another example would be cluster munition. The Ukrainians begged the US to give them cluster munitions in summer 2023. Both sides have started using cluster munition basically from day one. Very early in the war, both sides used their own stocks of cluster munitions, so this was not something that was introduced newly to the war theater. This was something that was already in use, and especially the moment the troops are on their way, the troops are mobile, cluster munition has a high effectiveness. It was not only not delivered in times of need, it was also not delivered in times when the availability of high explosive shells was limited. So when the Ukrainians were no longer able to shoot anything at all, or not enough, even then the US did not give them cluster munition for months upon months. ATACMS would be another example. When the first ATACMS arrived, it was the short-ranged ones with cluster warheads as well, but they only arrived months after the counteroffensive of the Ukrainians had begun and basically stalled and was in the process of failing. These ATACMS were not in active use. They were not freshly built. They came from depots. They could have been delivered half a year earlier without any problems. And the moment they got delivered, the Ukrainians were able to take out up to 25 Russian combat helicopters that before had blunted the Ukrainian armored spearheads, destroyed them. Those ATACMS were not delivered when they were the most needed. They were only delivered months later and immediately showed their effect. Whenever something is being delivered, it usually comes with limitations of how they are allowed to use it. But this was mostly directed in the US. Obviously, Germany was no better. The Taurus, basically an equivalent to the Scalp and to the Storm Shadow, supposedly somewhat better than those. Taurus until today is not being delivered. And in regards to the tanks, Leopard 2 and Leopard 1, the German government refused deliveries for months upon months upon months, and thus stalling the Ukrainian counteroffensive towards the Azov Sea, thus allowing the Russians to build the fortifications that then stopped the Ukrainian counteroffensive in its tracks. Both leaders of government have failed Ukraine. Both have not given them enough to win the war. Whenever they introduced new abilities or gave additional permissions to use the weapons, it usually was after Ukraine had suffered some catastrophes. They basically only get something new once they've had a serious setback. Effectively, we have to say both prolong the war. And they not just prolong the war, they prolong the war on the back of the Ukrainians who die and get maimed every single day. For Ukraine, on the other hand, we have to say a ceasefire only makes sense with security guarantees. Every stopping of the fighting without security guarantees would worsen the situation for Ukraine dramatically. Aid from the West would get smaller by the day, as it feels like it's no longer urgently needed. Now, initially, the deliveries would continue, but after a short time, the argument would be, yeah, we can send it somewhat later. Let's rather save the money for now. Or do they really need it? There's no fighting anymore there. Let's rather invest it in new bridges or in our children in the schools and something like this. It would mean by the day, Ukraine would get less aid than they got before, realistically over time. Ukrainians themselves would leave the country in droves. The moment a ceasefire has been declared, the Ukrainian government will have no choice but to allow men to leave the country again. They can't lock in their male population for the next decades. So the moment the ceasefire is declared, everyone who expects a flare-up of the fighting in the future and who expects that he has to fight then will hit town and leave the country. It also means that the refugees, a vast part of them, would not come back as they expect the fighting to continue in the near future, and foreign investment will not happen. Who of you would invest into Ukraine in a company where you expect that in 5 years this company is either crushed, destroyed, blown up by the Russians, or they simply take it away from you because they've conquered the territory? So there would not just be a drain in its manpower, in its population. The population would decline massively, also including obviously a decline in workforce, a decline in taxes that come, but it also would mean that foreign investment would barely happen at all. Ukraine would thus only stop fighting when they receive security guarantees or when they are in the process of collapsing. Stopping the fight any time before that makes no real sense for the Ukrainians at this point. To think about a deal is possible, but only if Trump makes it apart from Ukraine, basically ignoring Ukraine, not really talking with Kiev. He did it before with the Taliban. He didn't involve the government of Kabul. He talked directly to the Taliban. He even forced them to release 5,000 or 6,000 Taliban fighters as part of the deal, which then took up arms again and fought the government. And thanks to him losing the election in 2020, which in this case has been lucky for him, he was able to blame Biden and the Democrats for the failure of Afghanistan, claiming that he would have done everything better, which might have been, but we have no proof. It's obviously very easy for him to just claim that they destroyed everything, that they made failure after failure, if he has can't be compared with it. So he made a deal basically against the government in Kabul, but that allowed him to claim that he was the one who ended the war, who allowed the US soldiers to come home from an endless war, and in the process basically forcing the rest of NATO to leave as well, as without US support they were not able to continue all of this. But we have to see this is not the similar situation. Kabul was completely dependent on the United States. The logistics train for the rest of the armed forces there was also completely dependent on the United States. There was no choice but to agreeing to Trump's plan there, both for Kabul as well as for the rest of NATO. They had to leave with him, and the government in Kabul had to accept. Kiev has more abilities to act, has more freedom of movement here. As, for instance, it's directly next to NATO member states who have a vested interest in Kiev not being defeated. The automatic accepting of a Trump deal in Kiev is thus very unlikely, unless obviously Kiev thinks it's positive for Kiev, then they might accept a deal even if it was made without them being directly involved. But to talk about the potentials of Trump's peace plan, we have to first talk about his motivation, as obviously the way he would do it, the way what would be achieved has to be massively different in regarding to what his motivations are. So what are the reasons for a quick peace? What would be the options? I have identified 5. 2 of them are somewhat similar, and I'm sure those 5 are not all that are possible. You'll have some more. Leave it in the comments if you do. But to go through my 5 options, first is he does it for Putin. Part of the Americans believe he's a Putin fan. He's in his pocket. Maybe Putin blackmails him. He said in the past he praised strongmen, among them Putin. So maybe he admires him and wants to do something nice for him. So in this context, he might want to allow Putin to win as fast as possible. Second option would be he wants to be the guy who makes peace. He wants the person who wants the dying to end out of humanitarian reasons. The third one would be to sharpen his profile, to gain reputation. He is the one who ends wars. His supporters say that he's the first US president who didn't start a war, but who ended wars. That was one of the arguments among his supporters. This way would obviously help him. If he ended Europe's biggest land war, then he could claim he's the peace man. And Lukashenko, for instance, already said if he manages to end the war, he'll recommend him for the Nobel Peace Prize. Number 4 would be that he doesn't want US taxpayer money to go into a corrupt country, that he connects with the corruption of the Biden family. I'm not saying that they are corrupt. But this is something that is believed among the Republicans. That's believed by him very likely, and thus that's his argument whether it's true or not. So he doesn't want any more money, any US money to go into a corrupt country that is also connected to the Bidens. Number 5 would be, and that's obviously the most optimistic, he wants the best for NATO and for the United States and thinks that peace he can achieve is the best way for this. So we have 5 potential reasons for him to make peace, but they would require completely different circumstances. Let's start with number 1. For Putin, in this case, he needs to force Ukraine to give in as much as possible. This would mean the disarmament of the Ukrainians, no security guarantee, basically to allow Putin to do whatever he wants. From his side, it's basically impossible without threatening to aid Russia directly. It would require a Ukrainian capitulation, and he would have to force it. And I do not see a realistic scenario except direct involvement of the US on Russia's side to achieve this. So I don't think this is really doable. The problem there would be Ukraine would still not accept, and it would not be fast, because if he wants Russia to win fast, then he can stop the aid. But unless he starts delivering shells to the Russians, how are they going to win faster than otherwise? Than if he just stops aid and doesn't want them to win. For Ukraine, it would mean a complete defeat. Obviously, basically a capitulation. Russia would gain everything they want. What for Europe and NATO, on the other hand, it would mean that they would be mad. Trump would basically aid an enemy of NATO. NATO would be dead, and an impeachment would be likely. If we look back in the decisions in US Congress, be it for Lend-Lease, where there were only 10 votes against it, the overwhelming majority of the Republicans supported Lend-Lease for Ukraine in 2022. And when the compromise was made in 2023, the majority of the Republicans still supported Ukraine in that decision in the US Congress. If he actively helps an enemy of NATO, we can expect that parts of the Republicans would side with the Democrats for an impeachment, and it might be successful in Congress, in the Senate as well. So he might actually be impeached this time. So this is not really likely in my mind. Let's go to him wanting to be the peacemaker for humanitarian reason. In this case, it would be stop the dying as fast as possible, while also maybe achieving that the frozen war doesn't thaw anytime soon. Basically, main object would be no more dying. The war, but To achieve this, the war can't just pause. It needs to at least stop for a couple of years, at least until he's no longer president. And here we have to say neither Ukraine nor Russia want this right now. Ukraine knows that it's its end. It's over for Ukraine when the war is frozen for the stated reason. Migration out of the country, no investments, and a vast majority of the refugees will not come home. Financial ruin and the depletion of its own population leaving the country. Russia, on the other hand, can recover during that phase of the frozen war, of the frozen conflict. Ukraine can't, simply because it's lacking manpower and money. Without security guarantees, there will not be a future for Ukraine. So Ukraine can't do it. Russia, on the other hand, would profit from this, but they rather be successful now as they've spun up their war industry, as they've mobilized the personnel, as they claim that this is a war against NATO. If they have a choice, they rather win now than in some distant future where something might change. This is somewhat comparable with the number 3 option, that he wants to sharpen his profile, that he wants to be the peacemaker. Not for humanitarian reasons, but for his reputation, for his legacy, for being praised by his fans. He would be the first president who ended the next big war, who ended 2 big wars, and so on and so forth. This would be to sharpen his position, to make history. It would be somewhat in line with him meeting Kim Jong-un, with the North Korean dictator. This also led to nothing. But it made him the first, and it allowed him high-profile diplomatic meetings that a lot of people have praised him for, whether they have been successful or not. And from what I've known, they were completely pointless. What would he need to do to achieve these 2 options? Basically, be the peacemaker for his reputation or for humanitarian reasons. To force the fighting, no matter what, would be needed. But how? He has to give Russia and Ukraine reasons to stop fighting. And I've just mentioned that both have no reason to stop right now. Both would thus need a carrot and stick. Ukraine expects a worsening of its situation after a ceasefire. Russia expects an improvement without. So both have reasons to fight without significant changes in the situation. Ukraine needs to get something offered, that they take the risk of an unsecure ceasefire. So they need to get money, they need to get weapons, or even better, soldiers. Nothing of it what he likely wants to give them. It would have to be the Europeans. He would have to force the Europeans to convince them to send money, weapons, and soldiers to secure Ukraine. But they neither want to or can't. So some nations might want to, but they are simply not capable. They don't have forces strong enough. They don't have the economy for it. And others who might be able to, it's unthinkable that they actually will do it. So he would have to promise aid himself, that Ukraine thinks this is a better solution. But if he would have to give something. If he stops aid, it would force a Ukrainian capitulation, but not within 24 hours, as he said, in a very so basically, as I see it, within a short time, but rather in months, maybe in a year, maybe in a year and a half. So this would not lead to a fast peace if he cuts off aid. Russia would have to be forced to accept it right now. This could be done with maybe some more economic pressure, but mostly probably with the threat of additional aid for Ukraine. But in total, it would also, for Russia to accept it, it would mean that the aid to Ukraine that is given for Ukraine to accept it can't be so big that Putin is afraid of him not being able to continue. So for Putin to accept this concept, he needs to be sure that Ukraine can't recover, but that it gets weaker. So whatever this is, I do not see Ukraine accepting this. Ukraine also knows the historic example of South Vietnam. They got promised aid by the US after the US were withdrawing their troops, and that promise was basically broken the moment it was promised. Just a couple of years later, I think 2-3 years later, the South Vietnam was conquered by the communists from the north. So to achieve this is close to impossible. Europe would initially try to make up for the US aid and would try to help Ukraine continuing. But we have to say Europe is not willing to replace the US in this context, so it would not lead to a permanent solution. For Ukraine, it would mean a pause in front of complete defeat. during which time the population leaves the country. So it would be a catastrophe. For Europe and for NATO, it would mean a migration wave out of Ukraine, probably 10 million, even more. It would give NATO and Europe a breather, though. So a couple of years where the fighting is not happening, which Europe could use to rearm. But then we obviously see the issues whether the politicians would use that time for that in that regard. If we look at Europeans' rearmament since February 2022, we mostly see Poland taking it serious. The rest is fairly hesitant and fairly undecided, even until now. Even Germany, after getting additional debt in the size of 100 billion, Germany is far from being able to take its role inside of NATO afterwards. So whether this breather is actually being taken is far from sure. And the problem is that the quiet in the east there, which then would be forced, would likely lead to a slack in attention and a slack in defense investment if they aren't being pressured daily with the news. Why invest? Why buy more tanks if we can renovate the schools, if we can build a new university? Peace for every price would also mean that the aggressors worldwide would see it as encouragement, especially not just in regards to Russia, but also in regards to China. So let's talk about option number 4. He doesn't want to send US taxpayer money into a corrupt country that he connects with the corruption of the Biden family. As said, I'm not taking it as a fact. I'm just saying that Trump and his circle believe the Biden family to be deeply corrupt, whether it's it or not. Doesn't matter in this context if he believes it. He would want to stop sending money there, would be option number 4. In the past, whenever he was in his campaigning, he claimed that he's going to reduce public spending, that he's going to reduce the deficit, that he maybe even pays back debt. But while he was being president, the budget was increased and the debt increased even further. So now allowing him to say, I was the one who stopped sending billions to Ukraine would obviously be in his favor. He could claim that under the previous administrations, tens of billions were sent. Whenever Zelensky came, he left with 50 billion. Now he comes, he leaves with nothing. That could be in his favor. He could claim a success in this regard. It would be helped, surely, that he has, according to reports, very likely a negative view in the regards to the country of Ukraine, as well as in regards to Zelensky himself. He was the first US president to send lethal aid. Barack Obama failed Ukraine there. He sent sleeping bags, he sent Humvees, but he didn't send weapon. Trump was the one to send Javelin, but he prolonged the aid, he delayed it, as well as an invitation of Zelensky, the new president, to the White House to achieve that the Ukrainians start an investigation in the corruption of Joe Biden and Hunter Biden, which would have helped him in the presidential election in 2020. That was the reason for the first impeachment against him. And obviously, it would be likely that he holds a grudge against Ukraine in this regard, and that might be a reason to motivate all of this. What would be needed for him to achieve this? That would be the easiest one. He simply stops paying. He doesn't send money anymore, and basically his goal would be achieved in a heartbeat, but not the goal of peace. Ukraine would continue fighting for months, maybe for a year, maybe for a year and a half, but peace would not be achieved. What would be the problems there? NATO allies would obviously be displeased, unhappy, mad, and peace within 24 hours would be impossible. What would it mean for Ukraine? Well, financial and military aid from the US are missing, and the US is the biggest donor, the biggest help for Ukraine in this regard, and their aid would be completely lacking in this scenario. What would it mean for NATO and for Europe? The NATO states, the other Western states would have to take over. This is theoretically possible. The European Union alone, without all the other nations that help Ukraine as well, European Union alone has a GDP of 19.4 trillion US dollars. They could finance Ukraine the war out of their own. But it's extremely unlikely, as the theoretical possibility doesn't mean the political will to achieve that as well. In this regard, though, I think it would be used to have a scapegoat with Trump. It would allow the Western nations to give up on Ukraine and say it was Trump's fault. We couldn't do it on ourselves, even though I just mentioned again, and I did it in the past here on the channel, it's a European war, and Europe would be able to do it if they were willing to accept the pain and the suffering inflicted by spending billions upon billions on a war out of their coffers. But they could do it. Theoretically, in economic power, in financial power, and in industrial power, Europe would have been able to finance and to help Ukraine fight its war. If Europe decides that way, I don't think it's likely, but if Europe decides, and I say just Europe, theoretically it's Japan, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Taiwan to some degree, and Canada, if those other nations continue aiding Ukraine, they could. And in this regard, they could probably even buy American weapons. I do not think that Trump would stop export of weapons to Ukraine if it's being paid for not by American taxpayer money. It would mean that foreign currency flows into the United States to create and maintain jobs there, to create and maintain profits there, to strengthen the US industrial complex, the military industrial complex. If the European nations pay for Patriot missiles, I do not see how Trump would refuse the delivery if he's being paid with cash. So in this regard, if the rest of NATO would join in to, or rest of NATO and the other nations also helping, would join in to replace the United States, this would probably be the least horrible solution in the current context. But whether they are willing to do that is obviously a vastly different story. So let's go to number 5, and that's the most optimistic one. I do not think it's the likely one, but we had the worst option with him being a Putin shill, wanting to win, have Putin win. So option number 5 would be the exact opposite. He wants the best for NATO and the United States and believes that the peace he can achieve is the way to have the best outcome for NATO and the United States. This is obviously very optimistic, I know, but it's just fair to have the worst possible option as well as the best possible option. In this scenario, he would understand that a Russian victory in Ukraine would be devastating for Europe, but also for the United States, but also for Asia. It would encourage other rogue nations. It would encourage China. And this would mean that a fast victory, a Russian victory, a fast defeat of the Ukrainians would be an absolute disaster. This would mean that his goal would be to end the war fast, but without a Ukrainian defeat. What would be necessary for that? And there we basically have a blueprint that already is suggesting this. This is the Pompeo plan. Quick update here. This video was originally recorded on November 8th. By now, Trump has made it perfectly clear that Mike Pompeo will not play a role in his next cabinet. Even though at the same time, by now, Mike Rogers is being considered to be the likely Secretary of Defense in the Trump cabinet. We'll talk about him and what we can expect from him after this segment. Mike Pompeo is currently being claimed to be the future Secretary of Defense. He is close enough to Trump that he apparently did campaign events for Donald Trump. He is one of the few remaining of his first government who's still on good terms with Trump. And he is, on the other hand, he is a clear supporter of Ukraine. The bad thing is he's fairly alone. I, to be honest, do not know a single other person in the circle around Trump who can be considered only halfway pro-Ukraine besides Mike Pompeo. There might be a couple of others, but no one with his profile, no one with his prominence, so he's probably fairly alone. Still though, let's talk about his plan. We talked about it in the past as well. Basically, get Ukraine 500 billion in credits, probably secured by the frozen Russian money. Ukraine can buy whatever it wants with it, potentially even including Tomahawk missiles, cruise missiles that could strike Ural Vagon Zavod, the Russian tank factories. They can use the US weapon they bought inside of Russia to the degree they want to. So they can do deep strikes, they can do strategic attacks in the Russian rear to increase the pressure on the Russians. And on the other hand, this would be basically the carrot. The stick would be they have to accept the loss of the Crimean Peninsula. They have to accept the loss of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. But from my understanding, only in the size of February 2022, so not in their claimed sizes with the full oblast that are still not fully controlled by the Russians, but in the original size from 2022, from the beginning of 2022. Also, Russia would have to be made a accepted minority language inside of Ukraine, so thus rising its stature inside of Ukraine. But on the other hand, Russia would be allowed to keep the Crimean Peninsula, but in a demilitarized state. So they can't station their fleet there. They can't station bombers there. They would get the DNR and the LNR, the two so-called People's Republics in their old borders, and they would get the Russian as a national minority language inside of Ukraine to basically address the accusation that Ukraine wants to wipe out the Russians. Where are the problems there? Well, the pressure on Russia has to be big enough to force Russia to agree. That is possible, but it's very unlikely, we have to say. And even this still does not include a solid security guarantee for Ukraine, because the US under Donald Trump will not sign a bilateral defense agreement. It's unthinkable, at least in my mind, in the current state, that Trump would sign a binding agreement that forces the US armed forces to fight Russia in Ukraine on behest of Ukraine together with the Ukrainian soldiers. This is almost laughable to expect this from Trump. The other option for a security guarantee would obviously be joining NATO, but this is unthinkable, not just because of Slovakia and Hungary right now that would refuse the joining of Ukraine, but the same here. How would a United States under Donald Trump sign off on having Ukraine join NATO? What would it mean for Ukraine? Obviously, the end of the war, hope for a peace through strength. It would be a midterm solution, but not a permanent one. Russia would likely restart at a later point. Even if Putin signs binding agreements, accepting the new borders, accepting this and this, we already know that he doesn't care about signed agreements. He accepted the Ukrainian borders as well, and now he wants to annex parts of, or he has already annexed 5 of Ukraine's oblasts and probably wants to annex a couple more. So we can expect Russia to start the war again, unless there's an internal change of an epic size. And at that point, we have to say Ukraine alone will probably not stay strong enough to keep Russia in check over time. Even with 500 billion in credit, the problems remain. If the Ukrainians expect the war to start off again a couple of years later, then they still are inclined to leave the country. And if they can stock up on weapons now, that's all nice and good, and that might be good enough to help them hold the Russians back for a while, but the money is spent at some point, and the weapons that have been bought have to have crew that needs to be paid, and they have to be maintained, and at some point they are obsolete. So it would not be a permanent solution. It would be a solution for a couple of years, maybe 5 if we are optimistic, 20 years. That would be the time frame where the war would probably pause. What would it mean for NATO and for Europe? I said probably a breather for 5 to 20 years. If this time is used sensibly, if this time is used right, it would obviously be very helpful in regards to economics, in regards to defense as well. But we have to say, without security guarantees for Ukraine, it's likely that the war will start again in the mid-future. According to media reports, Trump is now considering Mike Rogers to be the Secretary of Defense. Mike Rogers is a representative of Alabama and a longtime Trump ally. He is known to be very strong pro-Israel and very strong supporter of Ukraine. In the past, he defended Ukraine in the Congress against accusations of corruption and against accusations that weapons delivered from the US are disappearing. As you might have heard in the past, there were always news that supposedly Ukrainians are selling weapons that have been given to them by the United States on the black market. He attacked this and said, "We are having oversight. We can assure you nothing like this is happening." He also attacked his own party members who didn't support Ukraine. He said that it's important to support Ukraine, to send Xi Jinping a sign of determination. And in the past, he has written that Putin must be punished by all means for his crimes against Ukraine. This does not mean that Mike Rogers will be in the parliament. This does not mean that the US will increase support or maintain support at this point. But we need to understand, if he becomes Secretary of Defense, which seems likely at this very moment, one of the most important cabinet positions in the Trump cabinet will be occupied by a strong supporter of Ukraine, and at the same time not just any cabinet position, but the cabinet position that is in control of the weapons, that can determine which weapons can be sent to Ukraine. So if he becomes the Secretary of Defense, the news is far less worse than a lot of the Ukraine supporters might have anticipated, but we'll have to see if he becomes the Secretary of Defense. I guess in the circumstances, in what people are expecting from Trump, this is probably one of the best news that was possible. It's going to be interesting what Trump is actually going to do. Those were my 5 options. I'm pretty sure you might have your own options as well, and you might have something to say. Leave it in the comment section. So far, we have no real clue. It's going to be interesting what he's going to do, what he wants to do. Trump has shown in the past that he's willing to do radical measures and that he's able to do them. And that will be the question, what he does if he proposes something and one or even both sides refuse. Will he just walk away like in North Korea, where he ignored that the meetings with Kim Jong-un basically just helped Kim Jong-un and were otherwise pointless? Or will he get mad and do something mad? The example for that would be the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the general from the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. According to media reports in the United States, it was done this way. The military usually offers various options for a president what to do in a certain case. And in this case, they always give a very extreme solutions to make other options less appealing and less extreme, less hard. The killing of Qasem Soleimani was the extreme solution. Trump was not supposed to take this option. The military gave it to show him that there are less extreme options. Trump still chose it. Trump chose to have Qasem Soleimani killed. Basically, if you can say, an act of war against the Iranians, who committed acts of war themselves before by providing the fighters in Iraq with various weapons. Probably Revolutionary Guard Corps participated in attacks on US soldiers, so it wasn't like out of the blue. But he took the most extreme solution, and if his ego is attacked, no matter by whom, whether it's Ukraine or Russia, it's possible that he walks away, or it's possible that he does a harsh reaction to that out of being insulted, feeling insulted, and this we'll just have to see. Another story in this context should be that Trump himself said by now that he planned to kill Bashar al-Assad after he used chemical weapons against his own population. According to the reports, the then Secretary of Defense, Mattis, stopped him from doing that, but Trump supposedly wanted to kill the dictator of Syria, who is a close ally of Iran and of Russia, for usage of chemical weapons against his own people. If the story is true, it would be another example of how Trump is willing to go to extreme measures to create deterrence, how he's willing to go beyond anything considered by others, perfectly fitting to the Qasem Soleimani example. Right now, we have to say we just don't know anything. Trump himself has still not said anything yet. We do not know if he even has a detailed plan. It might be possible that he has one. It might just be possible that he thinks he's going to wing it, that he says, I'll manage to do that. That might be his plan. Believing in himself to be that great negotiator, he might just think that out of the flow of the events, he might achieve something after all. Every rumor, everything we see right now is coming from his advisors, from people around his circles, or from journalists who claim to have informations, but nothing of this is official as of yet. Trump himself has not once publicly said, I'm going to do it this way and that way. Supposedly right now, his advisors are discussing a plan according to which the war would be frozen. There would be a demilitarized zone, so apparently both sides are not allowed to have weapons there. There would be additional weapon deliveries who would have to be paid by the US taxpayer to allow Kiev to continue defending itself. And in return, Kiev would promise for 20 years not to join NATO. So let's use the update to also talk about the demilitarized zone. I think it only makes sense if it includes the Russian-Ukrainian border, and this is unthinkable. Russia is not going to demilitarize its own territory, draw back troops from its own border with Ukraine. That seems ridiculous in the current situation. So any demilitarized zone would only make sense if it also includes peace troops, peacekeepers. But where are they supposed to come from? I read on the internet that it could be Europeans, but this is ludicrous. Russia will not accept this. Russia would accept Europeans along the border in this scenario, of which the majority are NATO members. Russia publicly says they are fighting to push back NATO to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. Putin has demanded again and again that NATO should withdraw from Eastern Europe, basically giving up its member states in Eastern Europe. And then suddenly he's supposed to accept NATO forces along its border. Before he fights to keep them out, now he suddenly would accept them marching up directly on the border. That's ludicrous. That's simply ludicrous, the idea. Ukraine, on the other hand, would not accept pro-Russian troops, so no CSTO troops, that's Russia's alliance, no troops from China, North Korea, or Iran, or anyone else closely affiliated with Russia seems unlikely, so those troops would have to come from neutral countries that are more or less actually neutral, so maybe some nations from Latin America, Asia, and Africa, but there we have to say they would never be strong enough to stop Russia or Ukraine in a reignition of the fighting when the fighting starts again, and their mandate would never include to fight on the side of the attacked one. So they would neither join Ukraine to defend against Russia or the other way, whoever does the attack. They would never have enough troops on the front line to have any serious impact. Basically, they would be something like observers that, like UNIFIL, withdraw into their own bases, go into their bunkers to not get attacked if fighting restarts. So those peacekeepers would be pointless, and the whole point of a demilitarized zone, if it even happens, would be very, very questionable. Without peace troops, peacekeepers, it's pointless unless it's really, really wide. But Ukraine is not going to give up 50 kilometers of its own territory along the front line and along the international border with Russia, where Russia could, in case of a surprise attack, march ahead and take it over. And Russia is obviously not going to vacate Ukrainian territory that it has conquered. Even if it supposedly stays under its control, they're going to keep their troops right along the front line, and they're not going to withdraw their troops from Belgorod, Bryansk, Kursk, etc., from the borders where the Russian Federation touches the Ukrainian state. So this is not going to happen. Peace troops, to summarize, won't be in big enough numbers to really make a difference and to stop the observer. And in total, unless there is something going to be added to this whole idea of a demilitarized zone, I do not see how it's supposed to work. Even if you separate them by 2 or 4 kilometers, it's not going to change anything, and it's not going to solve any problems of Ukraine. So why would Ukraine accept to this, and why would Russia accept to being forced to pull its troops back? We'll have to see if this changes, if there's going to be further developments and that idea becomes more concrete with more additional points to it. But as of now, I do not see this to be happening. We have to say, though, none of this would solve Kiev's problems. So the security guarantees are not missing, and we do not know that the weapon deliveries that are being promised are actually going to continue. None of this is guaranteed this way. So there is no reason for Kiev to easily accept that. This is not too promising in my mind. As I said in the past, if Kiev doesn't get a permanent solution, they basically have no reason to stop, because if they stop, it's just going to get worse. So continue fighting makes, under the current circumstances, the best option for the Ukrainians until they are actually forced to stop because their army is falling apart and the country goes bankrupt. So in the end, we'll have to see what the plan will be, how it turns out. Leave your comment. What do you think the options that I missed are? Leave your comment. What do you think about my analysis and my conclusions that I came? I also want to recommend the video from Anders Puk Nielsen. He did it a lot shorter. I was already working on the script when his video popped up, so still He probably helped me inspire this, so I just want to recommend it. I'll link it in the description. Anders Bugnissen, fantastic as he always is. Leave a comment. What do you think about the current situation? If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, despite the topic not being too nice. And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. But that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.